Anyway, hello. We're back. As I was saying to those who are present, we're studying the book of Esther today, and Esther takes place in the late 500s to the mid 400s years BC, while the Jewish nation was in exile in the Empire of Persia under King Xerxes. And this is a story, like so many stories, very similar to the book of Judith, in that the Israelites came under threat. Okay, they were being threatened to be exterminated from the face of the earth. At least those who were exiled in Persia at this point in time. And so this is it's a beautiful story of how God called forth a heroine, another beautiful young Jewish girl, not unlike Judith, and to bring about his desire to continue to be faithful to the Israelites even when the Israelites refused to be faithful to him. Right? God is always faithful even when we screw up. And I know that we screw up a lot, right? Yep. And so we were reminded of God's good graces this last week when we were going back through God's gift of salvation history to us. And so this Triduum is a perfect reminder of God's mercy, God's grace, and God's blessings, as are these studies that we're doing of these books of the Old Testament. Okay, because as we've talked about many times in this class, the story of Judith, the story of Tobit, the story of Esther, and the story of the Maccabees, it's our story as well. Because we inherited our faith from the nation of Israel, okay, and by God's good grace, and continues to offer that gift of his good grace to us. The things that are going on in this book is that King Xerxes is surrounded by wealthy princes and other individuals in his kingdom that are lusting after power and influence. They want to be as close to the king as possible, which is not a bad idea, right? You want to be close to the one who's going to protect you and maybe elevate you and your family to a place of prominence. That seems to be one of those, either a good desire or a disordered lust for those things. In this case, it was a disordered lust for these things by a man named Haman, who was willing to exterminate the entire Jewish race in order to gain his place of prominence. Okay, this book, as it begins to unfold, I don't know whether you may remember, but when we were doing the study of particularly the book of Exodus and Genesis, there were a number of sections of both of those books in the Old Testament where they had a set pattern within those books called a chiasm. You remember that word? Mm-hmm. Okay, it's a pattern. It's a literary pattern and a literary device that begins talking about one event that happens, and then it unfolds, and as it unfolds, it reaches a climactic point in the story, and then from that climactic point, it begins to work its way back up to a victorious conclusion. Okay, and it works.
Would you repeat that word again?
Chiasm.
Spell it.
Huh?
Spell it.
Chaism. Now, you need to look it up, because I probably misspelled it. But it's something like that. Look it up. Look it up.
Is it
I
like
think that's how you spell it.
I look up everything when you
Yeah, you know she fact
Yeah, it starts with like bookends of the same persons involved, And then it works its way into a very important part of the story surrounding an individual who has a design purpose, okay? And then on the flip side of that, it begins with that same person and the unintended consequences, if you will, that follows God's will for his evil purposes, okay? And so it just kind of moves in, and then it moves back out to God's will in the whole thing, okay? It's a very interesting way this book is set up. If you would like, I'll just kind of go through it. If you have this book that I've been recommending to you, okay, the Introduction to the Old Testament by Bergsma and Petrie, you look to page 488, and here's what the chiasm looks like, and then we'll go back to it, we'll read through it, we'll break it open, okay? It begins with a prologue where it states the greatness of Xerxes and his nobles, okay? Then it moves to an exuberant feast of the king, which results in an edict deposing the existing queen. Very interesting reason for that, okay? And then it goes through how Esther rises to the queenship in her place. Then a king is saved by a Jew. Enemies are slain. Mordecai saves Xerxes. Haman obtains an edict against the Jews. Mordecai persuades Esther to help. Esther hosts the king in her first banquet. Haman is honored. And then here's the conclusion, okay? Haman prepares to lift up Mordecai on a pole. He's going to execute him publicly, okay? But then Haman is forced to lift up Mordecai in honor instead of execution, all right? And then it begins to move back towards the victorious, okay? Esther hosts the king at her second banquet. Haman is executed himself, okay? Esther obtains an edict from the king on behalf of the Jews. The king saves the Jews. Enemies are slain. Jews authorized to fight back. Then there's another feast of the Jews, which results in Queen Esther's edict. And then the epilogue, the greatness of Xerxes and Mordecai once again. Mordecai becomes the honored noble in this case. So you see how it starts with a desired effect, and it ends up with a totally different desired effect, all right? So that's how the story begins to unfold. It's an interesting literary device, okay? And it's all over the Old Testament, a lot of them in the book of Genesis and in the book of Exodus, along with some of the other stories, okay?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Is that different from what you explained to us years ago about a lot of the Bible, the way it's written and everything? You talked about how it starts off and there's the middle and the end, but I don't think you called it a chiasm. You called it something else.
We use that word. Remember when we were listening to Rabbi,
From,
huh?
you talking about the videos?
Yeah. Who was that guy?
Oh.
Can't remember.
God.
Anyway, he was a rabbi. And we listened to a lot of his video snippets on
Alpha
different.
Beta? What's it called? Alpha Beta?
It's something beta.
Yeah, that was it. Alpha Beta.
Alpha Beta.
Alpha Beta.
I can remember.
But anyway, he explained how these chiasms they're just a literary device to unfold the story with its original desire and concludes with God's will being done. Okay, so it's part of the study that we did of the Pentateuch and other studies as well. A lot of people, most people believe that this book is not necessarily 100% historical, but does it have to be to have a purpose of God's divine will that it be included in the scriptures?
No.
It doesn't. It just has to serve his purpose in showing his mercy and certain people's faithfulness to him that encourages God to show his mercy to them over and over and over again. Okay,
Why
yes.
wouldn't it be historical? I mean, it has to do with the Jewish nation.
Yes,
Some of the facts.
but
I mean,
everybody has stories to tell from their own perspective, right? And when you're sharing a story, it's from your memory of that experience, okay? And it's my memory, but it may be not exactly how it unfolded in light of chronological events or things like that. It's real to me, but it may not be exactly historically accurate, okay? But that doesn't mean, and the book of Job is the same type of literature. A lot of people don't believe that Job was a historical individual, but the story of Job unfolds in such a way to show the glory of God and his power over evil, right? And his willingness to honor and bless those who are faithful to him. Whether Job was a historical figure or not is irrelevant. The story shows God's faithfulness to those who are faithful to him. All right?
same here.
Yeah. So a lot of people do not believe that it is historical. As a matter of fact, remember when the rabbi came out and spoke with us? He talked about the book of Esther. And in his Jewish world, it is absolute fiction. Okay? But it's still a great story that shows God's intervention into the human story. Okay? And so a lot of people believe that that's the situation with the book of Esther. Okay? Although it can be argued otherwise, because Xerxes was a historical king. Persia was a nation of historical significance. Okay? Some of the other individuals in this story and events in this story have a historical lineage, if you will. But just like we talked about in the book of Judith, the Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar of the book of Judith, was either obviously a different Nebuchadnezzar, or his name was used because of his prominence in history to make a point in that particular story. It had some historical problems associated with it as well that we talked about before. So, whether or not it is 100% chronologically historical is irrelevant to the message of the story. That's God's faithfulness to those who are faithful to him, and his willingness to inject his power into human history if it serves his purpose. Okay, and I think we're all okay with that,
It's
right?
a battle and a war, basically.
Yeah,
So like a battle and a war.
yep, yep,
I mean, for the Jewish nation.
for the Jewish nation, okay.
So I mean, to me, if he was the king, I wouldn't doubt the story, you know? I mean, why would it be considered fiction?
Well, and
We all tell
I'm just saying that
stories.
some
Forget the
people,
detail.
I know.
because if there are historical problems, I mean, known historical irregularities in a story, some people might say, well, if that's inaccurate, well, we have to throw the whole thing out, right? Some people think like that. We don't read the Bible like that, though.
You ever tell a story and, you know, you
You
can
make
get some
some of it
facts
up.
kinda out of line, but the gist of the story is still there.
That's my point exactly.
Okay.
How many of you are fishermen or hunters?
Our stories.
Yeah,
We're
oh,
the best liars on the face of the earth,
you
right?
ever tell a story about your hunting
And it
trip
gets
or-
better and better and
But
better.
you did go hunting,
You know,
It
went
gets
hunting,
better
but
over
that's where the
time.
truth ended.
and you got that big deer. It's all about how you got that
That's
big deer.
exactly right. The story is true, but the details might have been manipulated just a little bit to embellish and make it more interesting.
It might have been a 500-yard shot, well, maybe not.
It was
That
probably a
like-
50-yard shot, right? Okay, and that redfish was, what, 104 inches long instead of the 28 inches
I
it went
worked it,
to.
I had to work it at least 45 minutes.
So, you get the idea,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay, so because of that, it took a while for this book to, in both of its forms, okay? The book of Esther that is included in the Hebrew Bible is much shorter than the book that ended up being included in the Catholic Bible. Although both versions of the book were in existence at the same time, okay? And so we have 6 additional chapters. And if you read the book of Esther in the Hebrew scriptures that was translated into English, you would see a much different book than we're going to be studying today. It starts differently, it ends differently, okay? Now, when St. Jerome was putting together the Latin Vulgate, he included the book of Esther as it's in the Hebrew scriptures, but he assigned the additional parts of Esther as an appendix to that, okay? So consequently, the book was a jumbled mess, all right? In the Catholic Bible, the way they put the book together again made it much more readable. You got the entire story, okay? It's like when you read through the Old Testament, after you get past the Pentateuch, and you start reading the historical books, the writings, the poetry, the wisdom literature, and things like that, all of a sudden you get lost in the shuffle of literary presentations because it loses its chronological order.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, Jeff Cavins, I think, put together a way to read through the Bible and in a year, reading, I think it was 14 books
Yep.
from the Old Testament, and then the Gospel of St. Luke and Acts. Okay, and that gave you the history of it. And he said in the second year, chronological history. The second year, you go back through and then you start plugging in the prophets where they actually were, or when the Psalms were actually written and sung, okay, and when some of the other books are. And then over like a 3-year period, going back and reading things over again and plugging those things in where they are actually meant to be, it gives you the entirety of the story. So in order to smooth out the story and get the whole story, then you go back and you start plugging things in contextually. Okay, it's a better way to read the Bible instead of just reading it from Genesis to Revelation, because the story kind of gets lost in the shuffle, if you will. And so, so the same thing happens here, in that even though a lot of people don't believe that the book is actually historical, it's got some historical features within it. Okay, and so the Jews only accepted the shorter version of the book of Esther, and it is part of the Jewish scriptures. Okay, and the Catholics went ahead and rearranged it, plugged everything in chronologically and contextually to give you a better fleshing out of the book of Esther. And that's the one we are going to study. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any more questions about that? It's important that we understand it, okay? But you're going to notice that when we start reading this book, instead of beginning with chapter 1, it begins with chapter 8.
Yeah.
Right? And that's because they took the dream of Mordecai and plugged it in, because that's what started the whole story. All right? And then they start. So you'll see some chapter 1, 2, 3b, chapter 3, 4, 5, c, things like that. So you'll notice that as we go through the book, but don't let it confuse you. Okay, let me do that.
Yeah.
Let me be the essence of your confusion. Okay.
As always.
Any other questions about that? Yes,
You
sir.
said that Saint Jerome did this arrangement. Is he responsible for this work?
No. When Saint Jerome included it in his Latin Vulgate, he included the Hebrew version in its entirety, and then he appendixed the other 6 chapters. So you read them out of sequence. Okay, but they're there. Okay, and even in, I don't think these chapters are in the Protestant Bible, but I could be wrong about that. It probably depends on what Protestant Bible you get into. I think the first biblical edition, I think the Douay-Rheims was maybe the first one that put the whole book together in the Catholic edition of the Douay-Rheims. Okay, but I could be wrong about that as well. But the Douay-Rheims is one of those books that just gets it. It seems like a lot earlier than some others do. Okay, so if you have that edition, it's a wonderful edition of the Bible, Douay-Rheims. Okay, so we're going to be talking about all these different characters and how this story unfolds. I think you're going to find it interesting. I hope you're going to find it interesting. Okay. Any more questions, comments?
According to the Navarro Bible, where the problem happens is the Greek text is considerably different than the Jewish text and has a lot of additions to it.
Right.
So when they were putting them together, this is where their big problem was, and where you get into the A's and B's also being put in because of the RSV trying to
Right.
include it all.
Right. We have both manuscripts in their entirety. It's one of the rare situations where we have the Hebrew manuscript and the Greek manuscript. Okay, so that gives us a lot of room to waggle around in. Okay, so shall we read the story and see where it takes us?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to go to chapter A first, which is considered to be the prologue. It is a dream. It's a dream that Mordecai has that gets the whole thing kick-started. Okay, and you're going to see different names for the king Xerxes. Okay, this first name is Ahasuerus. I'm going to use Xerxes. Okay, just because it's easier to say. And when we get to some of these characters like Amon, we need to do a little historical background on it, because you'll recognize some other characters who have you noticed as we've studied the history of Israel, there's a lot of people who are just constant thorns in the side of the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amon's genealogy, if you will, we don't have it all, but we have a little bit of it, takes him back to King Amalek. Okay, remember Amalek?
Yeah.
He's the one that attacked the column of Israelites as they were going through the desert, and he hit them in the rear end,
Yeah.
where all the widows and women and babies and elderly were. So it wasn't a very fair fight, and Amalek has been a dastardly dude ever since then in the minds and hearts of Israelites. Okay. In the second year of the reign of King Xerxes, on the first day of Nisan, which is one of the Jewish months of the year, their calendar is different than the Gregorian calendar that we use. Is the Gregorian calendar that we use now?
Yeah.
I think? Yeah. So it's a different calendar. And the Jewish calendar is built primarily around the feast days that God assigned that the Israelites participate in on either a monthly, a daily, or an annual basis. Okay. Mordecai, son of Jar, son of Shammai, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin had a dream. Who else was from the tribe of Benjamin? Who was the first king of Israel?
Saul.
Saul. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, okay? And we're actually going to talk about him in this book a little bit, okay? He was a Jew residing in the city of Susa, a prominent man who served the king's court, and one of the captives whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken from Jerusalem with Jeconiah, king of Judah. This was his dream. Already we're hearing names that are familiar to us, right? Okay. There was a noise and tumult, thunder and earthquake, confusion upon the earth. Two great dragons came on, both poised for combat. They uttered a mighty cry, and at their cry every nation prepared for war, to fight against the race of the just. It was a dark and gloomy day, tribulation and distress, evil and great confusion lay upon the earth. The whole race of the just were dismayed with the fear of the evils that came upon them and were at the point of destruction. Who would he be referring to? The just. The Israelites. The whole race of the just were dismayed with the fear of the evils to come upon them and were at the point of destruction. Then they cried out to God, and as they cried, there appeared to come forth a great river, a flood of water from a little spring. The light of the sun broke forth. The lowly were exalted, and they devoured the nobles. Having seen this dream and what God intended to do, Mordecai awoke. He kept it in his mind and tried in every way until night to understand its meaning. Mordecai lodged at the court with Bagathan and Thars, two eunuchs of the king who were court guards. He overheard them plotting, investigated their plans, and discovered that they were preparing to lay hands on King Xerxes. So he informed the king about them, and the king had the two eunuchs questioned, and upon their confession put to death. Then the king had these things recorded. Mordecai, too, put them into writing. The king also appointed Mordecai to serve at the court and rewarded him for his actions. Haman, however, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, who was a high honor with the king, sought to harm Mordecai and his people because of the two eunuchs of the king. And here we go, chapter 1. Okay, this is where the book in the Hebrew scriptures would begin, eliminating the dream of Mordecai. During the reign of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. While he was occupying the royal throne in the stronghold of Susa, in the third year of his reign, he presided over a feast for all of his officers and ministers. The Persian and Median aristocracy, the nobles, and the governors of the provinces. For as many as 180 days, he displayed the glorious riches of his kingdom and the resplendent wealth of his royal estate. At the end of this time, the king gave a feast of 7 days in the garden court of the royal palace for all the people, great and small, who were in the stronghold of Susa. There were white cotton draperies and violet hangings held by cords of crimson byssus, whatever that is, from silver rings and marble pillars. Gold and silver couches were on the pavement, which was porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and colored stones. Liquor was served in a variety of golden cups, and the royal wine flowed freely, as befitted the king's munificence. By ordinance of the king, the drinking was unstinted, for he had instructed all the stewards of his household to comply with the good pleasure of everyone. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women inside the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he instructed Mehuman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, Abagatha, Zethar, and Carcas, and the 7 eunuchs who attended the king Xerxes, to bring the queen Vashti into his presence wearing the royal crown, that he might display her beauty in the populace for the officials, for she was lovely to behold. Okay, this is something we need to understand. Okay, the queen held, as you might expect, a privileged position in the kingdom, and she was afforded certain prestigious honors. Okay, and so this was way out of line for the king to command his queen to come and put herself on display for all of these underlings. They were nobles, but they were still underlings compared to the king. Okay. The Jewish commentators understand this, that she was wearing nothing but her crown. Okay, think about that. Would that be an embarrassing thing to do? Come display yourself before all of these people, most of whom were probably strangers in the land, or certainly at that banquet. And the king was drunk with wine and said, "Strip her down naked and get her out here." Okay. Was that a reasonable request?
No.
Well, he is the king. He is the king, right? I mean,
Just a little earlier, it said.
Who had,
It said that he drank for day after day after day after day.
yeah, he's drunk.
He wasn't there.
Yeah, he's drunk.
well, regardless of that,
He burned some
he
brains out.
stepped over the line, as most drunk men do.
Yeah.
You women know that, right? You've been to a bohemian wedding before. Haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've seen your man drunk, right? Okay, so that's what the idea was. It wasn't just telling her to come down here and dance for the people, okay? He was telling her to come down here, strip down naked, and just parade around so everybody could gawk at her a little bit. And what does she do? She says, "Not on your life." Right? And she had every right to do so, because he was out of line. Okay. Right. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the royal order issued through the eunuchs. At this, the king's wrath flared up, and he burned with fury. He conferred with the wise men versed in the law, because the king's business was conducted in general consultation with lawyers and jurists. That was his problem. He consulted with lawyers. Okay, he summoned Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Mers, Marsena, and Merbecon, the 7 Persian and Median officials who were in the king's personal service and held first rank in the realm, and asked them, "What is to be done by law with Queen Vashti for disobeying the order of King Xerxes issued through the eunuchs?" In the presence of the king and of the officials, Memucan answered, "Queen Vashti has not wronged the king alone, but all the officials and the populace through the provinces of the king Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and they will look with disdain upon their husbands when it is reported." King Xerxes commanded that Queen Vashti be ushered into his presence, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median ladies who hear of the queen's conduct will rebel against all the royal officials with corresponding disdain and rancor. What was the problem here? If the king can get away with it,
Yeah.
everybody else can get away with it too, and all the men will be put to shame by their ladies. Okay? And they should be put to shame by their ladies. They had too lofty expectations, I think. Okay. Let me see here. If it pleased the king, let an irrevocable royal decree be issued by him and inscribed among the laws of the Persians and Medes, forbidding Vashti to come into the presence of King Xerxes, and authorizing the king give her royal dignity to one more worthy than she. Thus, when the decree which the king will issue is published throughout the realm, vast as it is, all wives will honor their husbands from the greatest to the least. You think that's what's going to happen? I don't think so. Okay. Any questions so far? You understand the problem here, right?
What is the decree? What does it say?
Well, we're not there yet.
Oh, okay.
All right. This proposal found acceptance with the king and the officials, and the king acted on the advice of Memucan. Okay. Just in case it doesn't come up. The edict was that all women in Persia and Medes must be totally obedient to their husbands regardless of what they're asked to do. Okay? Not like Paul said, wives, be submissive to your husbands,
That's
as in the Lord. Okay? That's not the situation here. This is laying a burden on women that their husbands could abuse them any way they wanted to. Any way they wanted to. Because they had to be obedient by royal edict. If they refused to be obedient to their husband, no matter what they asked them to do, they could be put to death. Okay? This might put a little strain on a wedding, on a marriage, don't you think? Right. Okay. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, to the effect that every man should be Lord in his own house. Okay? No matter what the Lord wanted. All right. It's a good deal for the guys, I guess. Okay? All right. Chapter 2. Yes, sir.
But this is, this carries all the way through here. I mean, even the time of Christ where women weren't even significant, not to this extreme perhaps, but, you know, we see that even in the New Testament.
Culturally, particularly in the first century, women didn't hold much sway. Okay, they couldn't worship with their men. They had to worship in separate courts and things like that. And not only in Israelite culture, but in pagan culture as well, as it is today in some cultures. Okay. In the Muslim world, if a woman doesn't do exactly what her husband says, she can be publicly stoned to death. Okay, and that's happened in recent times. There's a movie about one. The husband was tired of his wife, so he plotted to have one of his Muslim brothers accuse her of adultery. Wasn't true. And then he got everybody to testify that she was an adulterer, and they stoned her. And he made his son throw the first stone. It's in a movie. I don't remember. The stoning of yada, yada, yada. That's a Muslim thing. Yada, yada, yada.
Let me Google that.
Yeah.
So yeah, culturally, women have often, to this day, been subjugated to men. Not in a good way. Not in a good way. Okay. After this, when King Xerxes' wrath had cooled, he thought over what Vashti had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's personal attendant suggested, let beautiful young virgins be brought for the king, sought for the king. Let the king appoint missionaries, commissaries, okay, in all of the provinces of his realm, to bring together all beautiful young virgins to the harem in stronghold of Susa, under the care of the royal eunuch Haggai, custodian of the women. Let cosmetics be given them. Then the girl who pleases the king shall reign in place of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he acted accordingly. I guess it did. get your choice of the most beautiful virgins in the country.
That's when they first introduced lipstick.
That's when they introduced lipstick.
Lipstick.
Yeah, I don't know who put that together.
Cosmetics.
There was a stronghold of Susa, a certain Jew named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem with the captive taken when Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had deported. He was foster father of Hadassah, that is Esther, his cousin. Hadassah would be the Persian name. Esther would be the Hebrew name. Okay. Let's see here. For she had lost both father and mother, so she was an orphan. The girl was beautifully formed and lovely to behold. On the death of her father and mother, Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. When the king's order and decree had been obeyed, and many maidens brought together to the stronghold of Susa under the care of Haggai, Esther also was brought in to the royal palace under the care of Haggai, custodian of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor. So he promptly furnished her with cosmetics and provisions. Then picking out 7 maids for her from the royal palace, he transferred both her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her nationality nor family, for Mordecai had commanded her not to do so. The plot thickens, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Day by day, Mordecai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was to become of her. Each girl went in turn to visit King Xerxes after the 12 months preparation decreed for the women. Of this period of beautifying treatment, 6 months were spent with oil and myrrh, and the other 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. Sounds like a spa to me. Then when the girl was to visit the king, she was allowed to take with her from the harem to the royal palace whatever she chose. She would go in the evening and return in the morning to the second harem under the care of the royal eunuch, Sasquatch, custodian of the concubines.
There he is again.
She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and had summoned by name. As for Esther, daughter of Abiel and adopted daughter of his nephew Mordecai, when her turn came to visit the king, she did not ask for anything but the royal eunuch Haggai, custodian of the women, suggested. Yet she won the admiration of all who saw her. Esther was led to the king Xerxes in his palace of the 10th month, Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all other women, and of all the virgins, she won his favor and benevolence. So he placed the royal diadem on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast in honor of Esther to all of the officials and ministers, granting a holiday to provinces and bestowing gifts with royal bounty. Okay. Need to tell you part of what is Jewish tradition on what took place here. The character that has not yet been introduced to us, Haman, also had a daughter, and he had a desire that his daughter be among those who would be presented to the king, hoping that her relationship to Haman, one of his royal subjects, one of his royal courtiers, okay, would be chosen by the king, and his entire family would be elevated, okay? Now, the story was that Haman and his wife didn't think their daughter was particularly beautiful, okay? How many of you have seen the movie called The Book of Esther? It's on the History Channel. It follows the story to a T, okay? It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. It is. The acting is terrible, but the story is good. All right. Well, they said that actually Haman's daughter was gorgeous. At least the actress that played her was really, really beautiful. Okay. And so, as it turns out, once Esther, to the disappointment of Haman and his wife, was chosen to be queen of Persia, she took Amun's daughter as her nearest confidant. So they both won. All right. It's a good story.
I have a question.
Yes,
What happens to the old queen?
Vashti,
we don't know.
yeah.
She was exiled.
Okay.
I don't, it's not, we're not told she was killed, okay? But she's out of sight, out of mind, okay?
It could happen to anyone.
Really?
She had plastic surgery and nobody knows who she is anymore.
Yeah.
She's Esther.
With all those
She's Esther.
cosmetics, yeah.
Quick turnaround. All right, miss.
All right, let me see. Where in the heck was I?
Talking about the assassination.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, we're on
The
the.
plot discovered,
Plot.
right? Okay, here we go. To resume, from the time the virgins had been brought together, and while Mordecai was passing this time at the king's gate, Esther had not revealed her to her family or nationality because Mordecai had told her not to. And Esther continued to follow Mordecai's instructions just as she had when she was being brought up by him. And during the time that Mordecai spent at the king's gate, Begathan and Thars, two of the royal eunuchs who guarded the entrance, had plotted in anger to lay hands on King Xerxes. We already heard about that in the dream, right? Okay. When the plot became known to Mordecai, he told the Queen Esther, who in turn informed the king for Mordecai. The matter was investigated and verified, and both of them were hanged on a gibbet. This was written in the annals for the king's use. Chapter 3. Any questions so far? Comments? Good story though, huh? All right.
So the two eunuchs were the ones that were put on the stakes, right?
Right.
At this point in time. Yep. Chapter 3. After these events, King Xerxes raised Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, to high rank, seating him above all of his fellow officials. All the king's servants who were at the royal gate would kneel and bow down to Haman, for that is what the king had ordered in his regard. Mordecai, however, would not kneel and bow down. The king's servants who were at the royal gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" When they had reminded him day after day that he would not listen to them, they informed Haman to see whether Mordecai's explanation was acceptable, since he had told them that he was a Jew. Okay, this first time his identity is fully revealed. Okay. When Haman observed that Mordecai would not kneel and bow down to him, he was filled with anger. Moreover, he thought it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Since they had told Haman of Mordecai's nationality, he sought to destroy all the Jews, Mordecai's people, throughout the realm of King Xerxes. In the first month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, the pur, or lot, this is a way to determine one's guilt and punishment. The word is pur, okay, or lot, was cast in Haman's presence to determine the day and the month for the destruction of Mordecai's people on a single day, and the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "Dispersed among the nations throughout the provinces of your kingdom, there is a certain people living apart, with laws differing from those of every other people. They do not obey the laws of the king, and so it is not proper for the king to tolerate them. If it please the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will deliver to the procurators 10,000 silver talents for deposit in the royal treasury." The king took the signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, an enemy of the Jews. An Agagite is a descendant of King Agag, who is of the house of Malachi.
Amalek.
Malachi?
I thought it was Amalek.
Amalek. He's from the reign of Amalek.
Amalek.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see.
11.
11. Okay. "The silver you may keep," the king said to Haman, "but as far as this people, do with them whatever you please." So the royal scribes were summoned, And on the 13th day of the first month, they wrote that the dictation of Haman, an order to the royal satraps, the governors of every province, and the officials of every people, to each province in his own script, to each people in his own language. This was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the royal signet ring. In other words, it was an unbreakable command. Okay. Letters were sent by courtiers to all the royal provinces that all the Jews, young and old, including women and children, should be killed, destroyed, wiped out in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month Adar, and that their goods should be seized as spoil. Okay. Here comes chapter B. This is an insertion, okay, that's only included in the Catholic Bible. The great King Xerxes writes to the satraps of 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, and the governors subordinate to them as follows. When I came to rule many peoples and to hold sway over the whole world, I determined not to be carried away with a sense of power, but always to deal fairly and with clemency, to provide for my subjects a life of complete tranquility, and by making my government humane and effective as far as the borders, to restore the peace desired by all men. When I consulted my counselors as to how this might be accomplished, Haman, who excels among us in wisdom, who is outstanding for constant devotion and steadfast loyalty, and who had gained the second rank in the kingdom, brought it to our attention that mixed with all the races throughout the world, there was one people of bad will, which by its laws it is opposed to every other people and continually disregards the decrees of the kings. Is that true?
No.
No.
Not continually, just this one time. Okay. So that the unity of the empire, blamelessly designed by us, cannot be established. Having noted, therefore, that this most singular people is continually in variance with all men, lives by divergent and alien laws, is inimical to all of our interests, and commits the worst crimes, so that stability of government cannot be obtained, we hereby decree that all those who are indicated to you in the letters of Haman, who is in charge of the administration and is second father to us, shall together with their wives and children be utterly destroyed by the swords of their enemies, without any pity or mercy, on the 14th day of the 12th month Adar of the current year. He's setting it up by lying his face off. They had not done any of these things. Okay, that's it. But how do you justify something like this?
It's only
This is going to be a genocide of an entire nation of people. This is not the first time this plan has been hatched.
He wanted to do this all because Mordecai wouldn't bow
Yeah,
down?
yeah.
Yes.
That was it?
That's it.
Yep, that's
That's all
it.
it takes sometimes.
Yep.
It's where fake news started.
Huh?
Yes.
I said it's where fake news started.
Right.
Maybe. But
Wow.
Fake
when-
news.
huh? But remember back in Egypt, you know, for a large part of the time that the Jews or the Hebrew or the Israelites were in Egypt, things went pretty well. You know, for a couple of hundred years, they were doing okay for themselves. Because when they were they were allowed to come into Egypt through a Pharaoh who was not an Egyptian. He was a shepherd, just like the Israelites were. So he brought them in, okay? And he said, shepherd all you want to. I'll even give you some of the best land, the land of Goshen. And they stayed there for a long time, okay? 400 years or so in total. During that time, there was a new Pharaoh that took the throne. And when he looked out and saw all of these foreigners, so he called them, because they weren't Egyptians, he said, we are afraid there's so many of them, they could overwhelm us. okay, and they could defeat us. So what was his justification for trying to eliminate or enslave the people of Israel? He said they're running around here like cockroaches. They're taking over everything and everybody. If they choose by their great number, they can overwhelm us. He was creating an environment that gave credence to his desire to wreak havoc on the entire nation of Israel.
It's known as a
Right.
false narrative.
Another false narrative.
There you go.
Yep.
What did Hitler do? The same thing, right? What are all those? Every time there is a genocide, you justify it first of all to yourself, and then you justify it or try to justify it to those in your inner circle, those with the power to execute that desire. We see it happening where right now? In Ukraine. It happened in Sudan. It's happened in Africa. You know, they say, you are less than we are. We don't want you around. We have the power and the will to kill you, so that's what we're going to do. And then they'll go about the business of justifying themselves to anybody who's interested. Okay? Why do you have to do that? Because it's such a terrible sin against the human race. So to execute such a judgment against an entire people is going to require some type of justification that gives you permission to do it. Okay? And this is the same situation. He's making things up to justify his desire to punish Mordecai for not bowing down to it. He's willing to sacrifice an entire nation to accomplish that. Is Haman a good guy? I think not. I think not.
I guess it runs in the family.
It does, it does. Okay. Where was I?
Esther.
Adar is the current year.
What verse?
Well, let's see.
Oh, we're in chapter, we're in chapter B?
B7.
Yeah, B7.
Bingo.
Bottom.
Okay. So when these people whose present ill will is of long standing have gone down into the netherworld by the violent death on the same day, they may at least leave our affairs stable and undisturbed for the future.
Wow.
Continuation of chapter 3 now. A copy of the decree will be promulgated in the law in every province, was published to all the people, that they might be prepared for that day. The courtiers set out in haste at the king's command. Meanwhile, the decree was promulgated at the stronghold of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to feast, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion.
So they knew, the Jews knew that this was gonna happen?
No, this was being planned.
Okay, so I thought
I think Mordecai had a sense that it was going to be because of that dream he had.
okay.
Okay, but it has not yet been revealed to Mordecai. He's yet to be notified that this is getting ready to take place. Okay, so we're going to need to stop there, and we'll pick up at chapter 4. Okay. I think it's a pretty fascinating
That
story.
is.
Okay. Hopefully we'll get something out of it. Next week, no class. Okay. Probably a few of us, myself included, want to go to Gloria's funeral. That'll be Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, I think. Where? At Holy Rosary?
In the
In
parish
the-
center.
I sent, I
Parish
didn't
Hall?
send you the, I didn't send you the obit that was online.
Well,
Yeah, thank you
we've got it.
for doing that.
That's when I realized it was next week and not this
Well,
week.
Yeah.
Doris is the one that put that out, that it was this week.
Yeah, and then I said, let me attach it, and I'm looking
Yeah.
at it, and after I sent it out, I'm reading, I'm going, oh, it's next.
And Marie's funeral is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Also, I presume, at Holy Rosary. She used to come to our Bible study religiously on Monday nights.
Oh,
And
I
she
saw
and
that.
Rose were best buddies, and she and Rose would always come to the Bible study.
I think her obituary even included
Yeah.
you in
It
that.
did.
Yeah. with a Bible study.
Bible study.
So, any questions, comments, concerns? Who feels called in to close us with prayer?
I will. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. There's a reading from Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. There is a portioned time for everything, and a time for every affair under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot the plant, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to be far from embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Eternal Father, align our timing to yours, bend our will to yours, place your yoke upon us that we become your obedient children. Grant us the opportunity and ability to love and serve you, and love and serve one another. Lead us to the seat of divine revelation that is unseen and unheard. And we ask this in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and we pray for the intercession of our Mother Mary. Amen.
Amen. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Everybody have a peace-filled week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. All righty? God bless.